as I realised that I was coming to the conference, I've been humming the line, first we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin. I've no idea what it means. If anybody could suggest an explanation, I'd be grateful. My presentation today is based on a paper that's available on the website, which is entitled Unemployment, Natural Rate, Epicycles or Hysteresis. On the handout in front of you, I've reproduced the equations from that paper. The full text is available on the website. I've also arranged for another paper co-authored by myself to be available on the website. If you flip the handout over, you'll see a diagram taken from that paper. So those two resources are available on the conference website. Okay. The first thing, I've been interested in hysteresis for longer than I'd care to admit to. In other words, I'm knocking on a bit. What amazes me is the flux in the popularity of economic ideas. When recessions come along, people become interested in hysteresis, but once recoveries from recession occurred, people lose interest. Okay. Now, why is this? Because there is a lot of evidence from Serra and Saxena, American Economic Review 2008, for example, that recoveries from recessions are only partial, right? So there are effects that remain. Now, is this because of loss aversion? That people value the losses associated with recessions more than the value of the gains associated with recoveries from recessions? Or is it due to some sort of cognitive dissonance in the economics profession, whereby mainstream economists have a preference for believing that the world is as described in the neoclassical synthesis or in the new Keynesian dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model? And so once recoveries from recession occur, instead of thinking about the losses associated with recessions, they conflate the benefits that occur from a growing economy with what has been lost through hysteresis. So this is quite a peculiar state of affairs. Well, let's start with the term itself. The term hysteresis was coined by James Alfred Ewing for the explanation of scientific phenomena in 1881. The context was Maxwell's equations for electromagnetic fields. Now, Maxwell's equations imply that if you apply a magnetizing force, then remove the magnetizing force, you should return to where you started off. Okay? What experiments with ferrite metals demonstrated was that that wasn't the case. You apply a magnetizing force, then remove the magnetizing force, the magnetic field remained changed. Okay? Now,
the microphone is a bit
closer.
Down. Yeah, we'll just move it down a little.
Down a bit?
Some people are having difficulty hearing you.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. Now, if you look at the diagram on the handout, this makes reasonably clear that hysteresis effects work in both directions. In other words, recessions bring lasting costs, okay? But booms in economic activity also bring lasting benefits, okay? Now, if you just go through the horizontal axis measures contractionary expansionary shocks. The Z variable is the set of so-called market flexibility variables that supposedly determine the natural rate of unemployment. So you take a given Z, then apply a contractionary shock, okay? The intersection with the vertical axis indicates the equilibrium rate of unemployment that you return to after the contractionary shock, and you can see the remnant effect of the recession. Now, if you go through a expansionary shock and then remove the expansionary shock, you see that again, this time there is a beneficial remnant effect on the equilibrium rate of unemployment. So there are two sides of the coin here. hysteresis paths are not reversible. We only pass this way once, as it says in the Old Testament, or as Heraclitus is reported to have said in Plato's Cratylus dialogue, you don't put your foot into the same river more than once, okay? But there is a good news story, blessings that come from booms in economic activity, which is the flip side of the coin of the curses that recessions bring. Okay? So there's a bad news story and a good news story. So economics is not all the time a dismal science in relation to hysteresis. What I want to do now is just run through three types of issue in relation to hysteresis. First of all, I'd like to look at the curious history of the natural rate of unemployment hypothesis. Then I'll look at various attempts that have been made to model hysteresis in economic systems, and then I'll have a brief look at the evidence for hysteresis effects in economic systems. If you look at the handout, equations 1, 2, and 3 summarize the natural rate of unemployment hypothesis. U stars the natural rate, U is the actual unemployment rate, and a key aspect of the hypothesis which doesn't figure in the standard textbooks is the third equation, which says that the natural rate acts as an attractor for actual unemployment. Okay? And there are sort of deep issues of existence and stability going on here. Well, why is the history curious? Well, who are the co-originators of the natural rate hypothesis? Ned Phelps. What does Ned Phelps say in his 1972 book? Well, he says it's very plausible to expect that hysteresis effects are present. If hysteresis effects are present, you don't have a natural rate hypothesis. Okay? What did Milton Friedman say about hysteresis? Well, in private correspondence, which Friedman allowed me to quote from in this paper, Friedman, here's a direct quote, the hysteresis hypothesis is simply a more sophisticated form of the natural rate hypothesis. Okay? So Friedman didn't believe in the natural rate hypothesis. In fact, Friedman went on to point in the direction of the first edition of Marshall's Principles, which has hysteresis in the main text, albeit not using the word. A fascinating research topic that some historian of thought might want to turn to is the relationship between Marshall and Ewing, the Ewing who coined the term hysteresis, because they were both professors at Cambridge University at the same time. Okay? Did they ever meet? Interesting issue. Why, if neither of the co-originators of the natural hypothesis believed in the natural hypothesis, why has this had so much coinage and leverage? Well, there are all sorts of explanations, the best ones of which are anthropological. Is there some sort of econ tribe run by some Politburo that dictates what correct economic thinking is, that where macroeconomic models have to be derived from representative agent micro-foundations? A great paper by Alan Kerman, 1992, Journal of Economic Perspectives, entitled Whom or What Does the Representative Agent Represent? Just demolished the representative agent model. Alan Kerman more recently has outlined a letter that he received after the publication of the paper from an assistant professor at UCLA, which said, I really thought your paper was great. I agree with what you're saying there. Representative agent models are unsatisfactory, but I've got to publish to get promotion to an associate professorship, then to get tenure. I know how to do representative agent models. I think I'm not going to be able to get on this career path if I do what I think I should be doing, but thank you very much for your paper. A guy called Buchanan, in a book published earlier this year called Forecast, was a journal editor for the journal Nature. Gets a submission from an economist on industrial growth, sends it to 3 referees, 2 referees who are a mathematician and a physicist, said, great paper, great statistical work, interesting observations. The Economist says, fascinating statistical regularity, but no micro foundations, therefore I recommend rejection. Axel and Leon Hufud published a paper in the early 1970s called Life Among the Econ. Maybe the anthropological angle explains quite a bit about what happens in our noble profession, or ignoble profession, depending on the way you view, from the angle from which you view matters. That's all I want to say on the plausibility of the curious history of the natural rate hypothesis. I'll move on to the second component of what I want to say, which is having a look at how people have attempted to model hysteresis in economic systems. I distinguish between 3 basic approaches. One that might be called simple hysteresis. About 1980, myself and Hargreaves Heap argued that, put together some simple models in which the actual rate of unemployment helps determine the natural rate. What was the argument there? Well, it was a very simple one, that if you look at reasons why actual unemployment rates change, the changes in actual unemployment are dominated by changes in the outflow rates from unemployment into employment, rather than the inflow rates from employment into unemployment. The corollary is that increases in actual unemployment after a short time lag are translated into an increase in the number of people who have been long-term unemployed, unemployed for longer than 6 months, say. Right? There's a host of evidence that there are severe scarring effects that arise from long spells of unemployment. So that was the rationale for these simple models of hysteresis. Nothing much to write home about, but give a hell of a better explanation of the evidence than the natural rate stories. That's one type of approach. The second type of approach came along with the NERU. The NERU is a misacronym for the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which it's not in accelerating inflation, it's a steady inflation. So whoever coined the acronym was just technically wrong. The story here was that Richard Layard and Steve Nittell in the UK put forward together a story about what determines NERU in terms of a battle of the markups model. So you've got a wage-setting equation and a price-setting equation, and the NERU, or the natural rate, comes out of that. Well, what they discovered pretty soon after they put forward the model was that it didn't fit the European experience, particularly the UK experience, because what happens was that the market flexibility variables, the Z variables, if anything, most of them went down in the UK in the 1980s in the face of Mrs. Thatcher's reforms. But actual unemployment, the equilibrium rate of unemployment, went up. So what they did was tack on a short-term effect of hysteresis into the model, and this was the arising from long-term unemployment effects. Now, they claimed that what would happen would be that this short-term NERU would be consistent with convergence to a longer NERU, or natural rates, in which the hysteresis effects disappeared. Well, in a paper co-authored with Danny Lang in the audience there, we demonstrated that this just doesn't occur. There isn't any such convergence from the short-term NERU onto a fixed natural rate pinned down by the Z variables. It just doesn't occur, given the parameter values in the Layard and Nittell model. Then a third type of approach to modelling hysteresis in economic systems is the Blanchard and Summers unit root approach, based on an insider-outsider model of how wages are negotiated. This had some traction on policy for a spell in the 80s, but seems to have lost its influence. In the last 2 or 3 years, both Blanchard and Summers have gone back to hysteresis. Larry Summers has been pointing out that the downward revision of output estimates by most forecasting models during the current Great Recession implicitly involves hysteresis. Okay? And similarly, Olivier Blanchard at the IMF has been pointing out that the multipliers are state contingent. They tend to be higher in recessions than in non-recession episodes of economic activity, the most obvious explanation for which is hysteresis. Well, that's the third type of method of modelling hysteresis in economic systems. My own preferred method is based on the Price-Act model of hysteresis. This is based on the formalisation of hysteresis as a general systems property by Alexei Pokrovsky and Mark Krasnozelsky, two Russian mathematicians, the English translation of which was published in 1989. Full references are in the paper. What this is based on is the idea that the economy consists of heterogeneous agents, people are different, who respond discontinuously, non-linearly, to the shocks to which they are faced. And basically the idea is that well, the simplest explanation starts off with markets, and for a firm for an operational unit, and you could consider a firm consisting of many potential operational units, the market price has to be above a certain level to trigger entry into the market. Now, the firm, if the price is above that level, the firm goes in, produces output, employs labour. Now, if the market price subsequently, relative market price subsequently falls, does the firm exit? No, because of sunk costs, uncertainties, etc., it takes a lower market price for the exit to occur. This is the real options approach to the determination of economic activity. So what you have is a lazy relay, and between the exit price and the entry price, the firm could either be active or inactive, producing output, employing labour or not employing labour, depending on whether this range has been approached from above or below. Okay? So that's basically what's happening at the micro level. Then you introduce shocks into the system, and what you have to do is aggregate over all these heterogeneous individual units. And what you find in the Price-Act model is that the system as a whole has a selective, erasable memory of the shocks that have hit the system, the aggregate demand shocks, if you like. And the system just remembers the non-dominated extremum values of the shocks experienced. Okay? So this is the Price-Act-based model of hysteresis, which is the one that I've been pushing for a few years now. Well, let's move on to the last part of my presentation, which is a quick look at the evidence in relation to hysteresis effects on economic systems. I mentioned earlier the Serra and Saxena American Economic Review 2008 paper on partial output recoveries. And the indication there is that if you look at equation 19 on the handout in front of you, that indicates how these estimates were generated. Now, they look at various shocks, those are the demi-variables in the equations, and ask, at a 10-year horizon, 10 years after the shock, what recovery in output has occurred. And it varies between the different types of shock. And it also varies, as Larry Ball was suggesting earlier, between different countries. Okay? But the one interesting figure, for example, is that for high-income countries, for banking crises, the permanent loss of output on a 10-year horizon is about 15% of GDP. Though, as with most economics estimates, there's a health warning. The 95% confidence interval is between 10 and 20%. Okay? So any economic estimates that you come across, big health warning, please. Then we look at tests of the NERU. And what's remarkable is that people pushing NERU models of unemployment or natural rate models haven't produced co-integration tests between unemployment and the Z, or market flexibility variables that supposedly pin down the natural rate or the long-run NERU. Okay? I think this is quite disgraceful. Okay? No, what some people do is argue that there are unspecified forces leading to changes in the natural rate or the natural level of output, time-varying natural rate. And what's often involved here is you estimate a spline, quadratic, cubic, and stuff like that. Well, I've done quite a bit of work on this for output. And Jesus, if you estimate these splines, the 95% confidence interval encompasses most of the actual variation in output, or indeed unemployment, observed. Okay? Now, what is going on here? And yet, mainstream economists keep saying to me, we all know that the natural rate hypothesis is true. Well, I can't, other than in an American context, I would respond with a word that starts with B and ends with T. Okay? This is just nonsense. Hence the term epicycles in the title of the paper, referring to the Ptolemaic attempt to defend a dodgy account of the movements of the planets. Okay? Then we have the return of demand. Larry Ball has done an excellent job in terms of pointing out the role of demand in explaining estimates of NERUs. In Larry's initial work, he took OECD measures of NERUs and asked whether these Z variables, market flexibility variables, could explain much of the change, and the answer was very little. The only variable that in the 1999 paper was the duration of unemployment benefits, the only structural market flexibility variable that picked up anything in terms of the cross-country evidence, the DUB variable. This is equation 20 on the handout in front of you, if you want to see the confidence intervals. But a variable that did pick up explanatory power was the degree of monetary policy easing during the first year of the recession, after the recession. Okay? So this was one means whereby you get demand returning into the picture for the explanation of unemployment. Larry's being more recently done work in which he's estimated his own NERUs, and this work has been extended by Stockhammer and Stern in a paper in 2012. And the story that comes out again is that the structural variables explain very little of the cross-country variation in unemployment relative to demand variables. Then we finally come on to my own preferred model of hysteresis in economic systems, which is the Price Act model. And what we did a few years ago was conduct co-integration tests whereby, as well as including structural variables, the Z variables, the market flexibility variables, we calculated hysteresis indices for various shock variables. These hysteresis indices pick up the non-dominated extremum values of the shock variables. And if you look at the last equation on the paper, 23, you've got the only co-integration vector that we could identify in relation to UK unemployment was equation 23, which has a replacement rate, unemployment benefits relative to wages in there, right, picking up some of the temporal variation. But three of the hysteresis indices, the non-dominated values indices, nominal exchange rates, real interest rates, and the real price of oil, these shock variables could pick up explanatory power. So that's completed the three main areas that I wanted to talk about. Maybe some fascinating pieces of speculation. One is that maybe I'm fascinated by what might have happened. For example, the guy who coined the term hysteresis, Ewing, was not only a contemporary of Marshall. Ewing was a professor at Cambridge. He started up engineering as an academic discipline in 1890. He was a professor at Cambridge 1890 to 2003. He subsequently went on to be head of intelligence for the Admiralty in the UK. He was head of the group, Intercept Group, during the First World War, for example, that intercepted the Zimmermann telegram from the German foreign minister to the German ambassador in Mexico, inviting the Mexican government to join the First World War on the German side in return for being given Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Okay? No, the British problem was explaining this. The Americans hadn't joined the First World War at that stage. The problem was explaining this to the Americans because the way they picked up this intercept was by intercepting. The German government had to use the US Embassy in Berlin, right? Code that was going to the US Embassy in Mexico, right? There's a transatlantic cable that passed the landward intersection was in Cornwall, southwest of the United Kingdom, right? So this was picked up here, and the difficulty was explaining to the US government they were actually reading and intercepting US diplomatic traffic, right? That was the big problem. Anyway, subsequently principal of Edinburgh University, but he was a fellow at King's College, Cambridge. Now, the only record in the biography is that the two people knew each other. At high table, Keynes discussed various matters with Ewing, but I don't know whether they ever got around to discussing hysteresis. Now, am I on my own thinking that the natural rate is wrong, and that it is an intellectual disgrace that the economics profession hangs on to it? Well, the answer is no. If you look at the current issue of the Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin, that's exactly the conclusion reached by Roger Farmer. The natural rate hypothesis, an idea past its sell-by date. Okay? And that, crazily enough, is the same Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin which has introduced an unemployment figure for UK interest rate setting policy. Right? The commitment now is not to reduce interest rates until unemployment falls below 7%. Right? Now, the Bank of England current forecasting model doesn't explain unemployment. Right? Now, what the hell is going on? Now, somebody's cobbled together some forecasts for a short-run Nauru, which was, in August, the actual unemployment rate was 7.8%. The trigger for below which you're not going to cut interest rates is 7%. The estimate for the short-run Nauru is 6.5%. How was that derived? And the long-run Nauru estimate was around 5%. They couldn't put confidence intervals around these things. Right? Where did the things come from? Right? And it's fascinating that people who are in the business of estimating natural rates of unemployment, or NARUs, have not done the job properly. Because in most of these models, in terms of estimating confidence intervals, because in most of these models, the NARU, short run, long run, whatever it is, or natural rate, is a ratio between coefficients, right? No, you can't just download that from a standard computer program. You have to use something like a Feeler method or Monte Carlo methods to bootstrap these confidence intervals. Now, if you actually publish these confidence intervals alongside the central estimate, people say, how on earth should I believe that? Okay. Now, one thing that might stimulate further research on hysteresis is this policy innovation. The Federal Reserve System in the United States has an unemployment trigger of 6.5%. UK now has a trigger of 7%. I don't know whether the European Central Bank is considering such a trigger for the Eurozone. But it's this sort of policy innovation that's likely to trigger serious work on unemployment. And when people have a look at how bad this work is, this might stimulate a reallocation of resources, again, away from DSGE models in which you have a single representative agent who has a choice between how many hours to work. There's no unemployment or employment decision in the model. It's just a decision about how many hours does this representative agent work. What we need is a massive allocation of resources away from this nonsense, right, towards something that's interesting, that can talk about what actually goes on in the observable world. And lo and behold, price act models have the very controversial property that in them people are different. How remarkable is that? Now, the number of times I've sat in seminar rooms and somebody's just used a representative agent model, which is based on the idea that everybody's the same, and people can take this seriously. I rest my case.